The alarm on my wrist buzzed twice, which meant one thing. Something had gone wrong inside the chamber, and I was not supposed to be watching, but I was already inside the visitor gallery when the vote came through. My name is Oliver Bennett, and 3 years ago, I was a junior systems engineer, assigned to a diplomatic outpost that most people back home had never heard of. That day, I was sitting in a glass booth above the council floor, translating technical reports for a delegation that had stopped listening to me an hour earlier. The chamber was shaped like a bowl, with seats rising in circles around a central platform. Delegates from 11 species sat in their designated rings, each one wrapped in whatever atmosphere or light or fluid kept them alive. I had learned to read their moods by the way their light patterns shifted, by the way their translators clicked before they spoke. When the vote came up on the main display, I did not understand it at first. The words were simple. The meaning was not. Species designation: human. Status: unregistered biological asset. Classification: property of the Galactic Council. Pending sponsor assignment. I read it 3 times before my mind accepted what it meant. We were not being welcomed. We were not being warned. We were being claimed. The same way a surveyor claims an empty plot of land. The same way someone tags a wild animal before it becomes property of a reserve. Nobody in that chamber looked at the human seat, because there was no human seat. We had never been given one. We had been discovered, catalogued, and quietly filed away as unclaimed, and now that filing had turned into ownership. I sat there with my hands pressed flat against the glass, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize a door you thought was open has actually been locked the whole time. The delegate from the water world, a broad silver creature named Vesa Kor, turned toward the human observation booth for the first time since the session began. Her voice came through my earpiece, calm and almost gentle. "Do not be alarmed," she said. "This is standard procedure. Every species discovered without an established patron eventually receives a designation. Yours was simply overdue." I asked her what happened to species that never found a patron. She did not answer right away. When she did, her tone had not changed at all, which somehow made it worse. "They are assigned one," she said, "whether they wish it or not." I did not respond. I did not trust my own voice in that moment. Instead, I opened a private channel back to Earth, routed through the relay station, 3 jumps away, and I began recording a message that I was not authorized to send without approval. I sent it anyway. I told them what I had seen. I told them the words exactly as they appeared on the display, because I did not want anyone back home to soften what had happened, and I did not want to be the one who softened it either. I remember staring at the transmission light on my console, waiting for it to finish sending, feeling like I was standing at the edge of something enormous and dark, something that had no bottom. When the light finally turned green, I expected panic. I expected emergency broadcasts, sirens, maybe even chaos in the capital. That was what I had seen in every story I had grown up with, the moment when the truth arrives and the world falls apart. Instead, there was silence. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of people too afraid to speak. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes from people who already know exactly what they are going to do next and are simply waiting for the right moment to do it. 3 hours later, a single reply came back to me, short and precise, from a name I recognized but had never worked with directly. Edward Miles, a coordinator inside the Ministry of Off-World Affairs. The message read only this: confirmed. Proceed to Phase 2. Return home when possible. Do not respond to further council communication without clearance. I did not know what Phase 2 meant. I had never heard the phrase before in my life, but something about the calmness of it, the total absence of surprise in 4 short sentences, told me that whatever was coming had been planned for a very long time, long before I had ever stepped into that glass booth. I looked back down at the chamber. The delegates were already moving to the next item on their agenda, as if declaring an entire species property was a minor formality, something to be processed and forgotten. None of them noticed that the light above the human observation booth had gone dark, because I had already begun packing my equipment. None of them noticed that somewhere behind their confident voices, on a small blue world 3 jumps away, something enormous had just been set into motion. I did not know yet what Earth intended to do. I only knew that whatever it was, they were not going to ask permission first. For the first time since I had left home to serve as a translator among the stars, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. It was quiet, and it was steady, and it felt almost like relief. We were done waiting to be noticed. I gathered my files, sealed my terminal, and made my way toward the transport bay, unaware that the next message I would receive would explain exactly why Earth had never once tried to argue with the Council about jumpgate technology, and why that silence had never meant we did not understand it. It meant the opposite. The transport ship that carried me back toward the relay station was small, barely large enough for 6 passengers, and I sat alone near a viewport that looked out onto open space. I kept replaying the moment the designation appeared on the screen, trying to understand how an entire species could be filed away like unclaimed cargo. The pilot, a quiet man named Nathan Cole, had served on outposts near Council space for almost a decade. He noticed the tension in my shoulders before I said a single word. "You saw the vote," he said. It was not a question. I nodded. He did not seem surprised, and that unsettled me more than anything else that day. "Most people think first contact is the dangerous part," he said. "It never is. The dangerous part is what happens after they decide you are not dangerous at all." I asked him what he meant. He looked out at the stars for a long moment before answering. "They classified us as primitive," he said. "They classified us as harmless. That was our mistake to let them believe, and our advantage to use." I did not understand him fully at the time. I only understood that whatever Earth had been building in the shadows of Council indifference, it had never been built out of weakness. By the time we reached the relay station, I had received a second message from Edward Miles. This one was longer, and it was addressed only to me. "You are needed at the coordination center," it read. "Your fluency with Council systems is required. Report within 48 hours. This is not a request." I looked at those words for a long time before I closed the message. Whatever Phase 2 was, I was no longer just watching it happen. I was about to become part of it. The relay station itself was a strange place to wait for orders. A ring of metal and glass built by 3 different species over 2 centuries, patched together so many times that no single design remained. Traders moved through its corridors without noticing me at all, unaware that the small blue world I came from had just been declared property. I found a quiet corner near the observation deck and watched a Council supply vessel dock nearby, its crew unloading crates without urgency, without any sign that the universe had shifted beneath their feet. I envied them for a moment. They did not know yet. Their ignorance looked almost peaceful. A message arrived on the public feed an hour later, broadcast across every relay station in Council territory, informing all member species that a newly designated asset world had been added to the general registry. My homeworld was listed by coordinates, not by name. Population estimated, resources noted, threat level marked as negligible. I read that last line more than once. Threat level, negligible. I thought about Nathan Cole's words on the transport ship, about how being underestimated was not a mistake at all, and for the first time I began to wonder just how long humanity had been quietly preparing for a moment like this one. I did not sleep during the wait for my connecting transport. I kept replaying every strange detail from the years before, moments that had seemed unimportant at the time, requests from Earth for outdated gate schematics, framed as academic curiosity. Engineers rotated through Council outposts more often than any other species, always eager to observe maintenance work, always polite, always harmless in appearance. Grants approved for research into gate stability that no other species had bothered to fund, because no other species needed to understand something they had built themselves centuries ago. At the time, I had assumed humanity was simply curious, eager to catch up on technology we had not invented. I had never once considered that curiosity itself might be a strategy. When my connecting ship finally arrived, it was a small Council transport repurposed for human passengers, staffed by a skeleton crew who barely acknowledged me. I boarded without complaint, strapped into a seat designed for a different anatomy, and closed my eyes as the engines hummed to life. Somewhere behind those tired eyes, my mind kept circling back to one simple, unavoidable question. If humanity had spent years quietly studying the gates that connected every world in Council space, then whatever Edward Miles meant by Phase 2 was not going to be a protest, and it was not going to be a request. It was going to be a demonstration. I did not know yet how right I was. or how much my own hands would be part of what came next. The coordination center was buried 3 levels beneath a research campus outside the capital, a place I had visited only twice before, both times for training sessions that seemed unremarkable at the time. This time, the guards at the entrance checked my identification twice, scanned my hands, and escorted me down a corridor I had never been shown. Edward Miles was waiting at the far end, standing beside a woman I did not recognize, tall and steady, with the kind of posture that comes from years of making decisions under pressure. She introduced herself as Charlotte Pierce, lead coordinator for what she called the Continuity Project. "You transmitted the verdict faster than any other observer in the field," she said, without any greeting. "That earned you a seat at this table. Whether you keep that seat depends on how well you listen in the next 10 minutes. I told her I was listening. She led me into a room lined with screens, each one displaying a different section of the Galactic jump gate network, a web of glowing lines connecting hundreds of systems. At the center of that web sat a single point, marked in a color none of the others shared. Home. "Every species in Council space depends on these gates," Charlotte said. "None of them can travel between stars without using this network, because natural travel between systems takes centuries, and no species has ever solved that problem on their own. The gates are the only reason any of this," she gestured at the web of light, "functions as a civilization at all. I already knew this. Every child in Council space learned it early, the same way children on Earth once learned that ships needed water to float. It was not new information." What she said next was, "The gates were not built by the Council," Charlotte said. "They were inherited. An older civilization built this network long before any current species existed, and vanished long before anyone arrived to ask why. The Council maintains the gates. They do not fully understand them. No species does, not even the ones who have used them the longest." I felt something shift in my chest, the same cold feeling from the observation booth, but sharper this time. "Except us," I said. Charlotte allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Except us, almost." She explained what humanity had been doing for nearly 2 decades, ever since the first human engineers were allowed to study gate maintenance logs as part of a minor research agreement that the Council had approved without concern, because no one imagined a species so recently arrived could accomplish what centuries of established species had failed to achieve. Human researchers had noticed patterns the Council maintenance crews had missed, patterns buried inside the mathematics of the gate architecture itself. It began as an academic curiosity, a strange elegance in the numbers that did not match any known engineering principle used by current Council species. Slowly, carefully, without ever drawing attention, those researchers began testing small theories, adjusting minor calibration settings during authorized maintenance windows, always framed as routine work, always approved by officials who saw humans as harmless technicians, eager to learn. What those researchers eventually discovered was something no other species had found in centuries of use. A layer of control embedded deep within the gate network, a kind of master architecture that could be accessed only through a specific mathematical sequence, one that had never been documented anywhere in Council records, because the species who built the gates had never shared it with anyone. Humanity had found it by accident, buried inside patterns that looked like errors to everyone else, and had spent years quietly confirming what it meant, without ever telling the Council what they had found. She walked me through the discovery itself, describing how a small team of researchers stationed at a distant Council outpost had first noticed the anomaly. A woman named Grace Whitfield, one of the earliest human engineers permitted to study gate maintenance schedules, had spent months cataloging routine calibration logs that every other species treated as tedious record-keeping rather than meaningful data. Where Council engineers saw noise, Grace saw structure, a repeating pattern buried so deeply within the numbers that it had gone unnoticed for centuries, simply because no one had ever looked for it with fresh eyes. She brought her findings to a small internal team, Charlotte said, convinced she had found nothing more than an interesting curiosity. It took nearly 2 years of quiet, careful testing before anyone realized what that curiosity actually represented. By the time we understood its full scope, the decision about whether to share it had already become far more complicated than a simple choice between honesty and secrecy. "We could have told them," Charlotte continued. "There were people in our own government who argued for exactly that. Share the discovery, earn trust, earn a seat among the recognized species, instead of waiting to be granted one. What happened to that argument? I asked. Charlotte's expression did not change, but her voice grew quieter. It lost, the day the council began drafting language to classify unclaimed species as property instead of independent civilizations. Once we understood that any goodwill we offered could simply be filed away and ignored, the argument for trust became much harder to defend. I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the glowing web of light connecting hundreds of worlds, understanding for the first time that the point marked home was not the weakest position on that map. It might have been the strongest. Edward Miles finally spoke, his voice calm, in the way that people speak when they have already made peace with an enormous decision. You are here because you understand council communication better than almost anyone we have. When this begins, someone will need to explain to them exactly what has happened, in language they cannot misunderstand or dismiss. That is going to be you. I asked him what exactly was about to begin. He turned toward the largest screen in the room, where a countdown had already been running silently in the corner, numbers falling steadily toward 0. For over a decade, he said, every gate in council space has been quietly connected to relay stations we built ourselves, disguised as standard communication equipment, approved under agreements the council barely reviewed, because they assumed we were simply catching up to their technology. Those relay stations are not communication equipment, they are access points. The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of machines, and the soft, steady ticking of that countdown. When the timer reaches 0, Edward continued, every gate in the network will receive a new set of instructions, issued through the master architecture our researchers discovered. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply, and completely, placed under new control. I looked at the countdown, then back at Charlotte, then at the glowing web of connected worlds stretching across every screen in the room. You are about to lock an entire galaxy out of its own transportation network, I said, and my voice did not sound entirely like my own. No, Charlotte said. We are about to remind an entire galaxy that the species they called negligible built the key to their own survival, and never once asked for permission to hold it. She handed me a headset, the same kind used for official council translations, and gestured toward an empty seat at the communication console. When this happens, she said, there will be confusion first, then fear, then anger. Someone on the other side of that fear needs to speak clearly, calmly, and without apology. That is the seat you are sitting in now. I put on the headset with hands that were not entirely steady, watching the countdown fall past the 2-minute mark, aware that whatever certainty Earth's leaders carried into this moment, I still felt the weight of what was about to happen settle heavily across my shoulders. Nathan Cole entered the room quietly behind me, taking a position near the far wall beside 2 other engineers I did not recognize, each of them watching their own private displays filled with lines of code scrolling too quickly to read. You look nervous, he said, without turning to face me. I feel like we are about to break something that cannot be fixed, I admitted. He allowed a small, tired smile, the same expression Charlotte had worn earlier. We are not breaking anything, he said. We are simply choosing who holds the door, and for the first time in our history, it happens to be us. The countdown reached the 1-minute mark, and the room grew even quieter, as if everyone inside it had stopped breathing at the same moment. I stared at the point marked home, on the glowing web of light, and for the first time since stepping into that observation booth days earlier, I understood exactly what Phase 2 had always meant. It was not a message. It was a door closing, all across the galaxy, with humanity's hand on the final lever. Charlotte must have noticed the look on my face, because she stepped closer and lowered her voice so only I could hear her. You are wondering if this was the only option, she said. I nodded, unable to find better words in that moment. We wondered the same thing for years, she said. There were meetings that lasted through entire nights, arguments between people who genuinely believed we could earn a place among the council through patience and cooperation, and people who believed patience would only be read as weakness. I sat in rooms where both sides were right, depending on which version of the council you were speaking to. She glanced toward the countdown, now under 45 seconds, and continued. The species who run the council are not cruel by nature, she said. Most of them believe the current order keeps the galaxy stable, and in a strange way it does. Stability was never our enemy. What frightened us was permanence. Once a species is registered as property, there has never been a recorded case of that status changing, not in centuries of council history. We searched. We asked quiet questions through allies who trusted us. There was no path back from that designation, not through petition, not through diplomacy, not through good behavior. So this became the only door left open, I said. This became the only door we controlled, she corrected gently. Nathan Cole spoke from his position near the wall, still watching his display without looking up. There is a difference between destroying something and holding it still, he said. We chose stillness. It costs us nothing we cannot rebuild. It costs them everything they assumed would never move. I thought about the alien delegate, Vesa Kor, and the calm certainty in her voice when she told me not to be alarmed, that my species being classified as property was simply standard procedure, overdue rather than unusual. I wondered if she had any idea what standard procedure was about to collide with. The countdown crossed under 30 seconds, and the room grew tense in a way that felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened. One of the engineers near the far wall, a young man with tired eyes who had clearly not slept in days, spoke quietly to no one in particular. Every simulation we ran predicted panic first, then negotiation within 72 hours. I hope the simulations were right. They will be angry before they are willing to talk, Charlotte said. Anger is easier for them than admitting they never understood the thing they depended on most. I asked her what happened if the council decided to respond with force instead of negotiation, if anger never gave way to conversation at all. She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried none of the confidence from a moment earlier, only quiet honesty. Then we deal with that when it comes, she said. But species who cannot travel between their own systems cannot easily organize a unified response either. That was always part of the calculation. The countdown reached 15 seconds, and the low hum of machines around the room seemed to rise in pitch, though I suspected that was simply my own nerves shaping what I heard. I thought of my parents, still asleep somewhere on the surface far above this buried room, unaware that the decision being made beneath their feet would reshape the next chapter of every human life, including theirs, including mine. I thought of Vesa Kor's silver light patterns shifting calmly across the council chamber, utterly certain that nothing about that day's vote required urgency. I thought of the point marked home on the glowing map, small and steady among hundreds of larger, older worlds, and I understood, perhaps for the first time completely, that smallness had never meant what the council assumed it meant. The countdown reached 5 seconds. Charlotte placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, the kind of gesture meant to steady someone rather than comfort them. Whatever happens after this, she said, you did nothing wrong by transmitting that verdict home. You gave us the final piece of timing we needed. Everything after this belongs to all of us together. The countdown reached 0. For 1 full second, nothing appeared to happen at all. The screens continued glowing steadily, the hum of machines did not change, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I wondered if the entire plan had failed silently, without any of us noticing. Then every line on the glowing map flickered at once, and the point marked home pulsed with a brighter light than any other system on the display. Somewhere across hundreds of connected worlds, in ways I could not yet see or fully understand, the galaxy's oldest and most trusted network had just been quietly, completely, taken over by the species it had never bothered to properly notice. The first sign that something had gone wrong reached us not through our own instruments, but through a panicked signal bouncing across an open council frequency, one that our systems were still monitoring out of habit. A trade vessel, mid-transit between two systems, reported that its gate window had simply vanished without warning, leaving the ship stranded in open space, with no destination coordinates and no way to reverse its course. Charlotte leaned toward the main console, watching the same open frequency fill with similar reports, one after another, faster than any single voice could track. Ships caught mid-jump, stations losing contact with neighboring systems, automated trade routes returning error codes that had never existed in council records before that exact moment. "It is working," Nathan said quietly, though there was no celebration in his voice, only the steady focus of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as expected. I had imagined this moment differently in the few minutes before it happened. I had imagined explosions, or warning sirens, or some visible sign of destruction spreading across space. Instead, what I witnessed was quieter and somehow more unsettling. Nothing broke. Nothing collapsed. The gates simply stopped answering, the way a door might stop opening no matter how many times you turned its handle, without ever showing a crack or a scratch to explain why. Charlotte activated a private channel connecting our room directly to a secure listening post near the edge of council space, staffed by human diplomats who had been quietly stationed there for exactly this purpose. Their voices came through calm but tense, describing scenes unfolding across dozens of systems within minutes of the shutdown. At a major trade hub near the outer rim, 3 different species had gathered along the edge of what used to be an active gate platform, staring at a shimmering field that no longer responded to any known activation sequence. Security teams attempted manual overrides using established maintenance codes that had worked without fail for centuries, and received nothing but silence in return. At a smaller outpost near Council Territory's edge, an emergency vessel carrying medical supplies had been forced to turn back mid-route, its captain reporting confusion rather than anger, unable to understand how an entire section of the network could simply cease functioning without any detectable cause. I listened to these reports pour in, one after another, and felt the full size of what we had done settle over me like a physical weight. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was not a warning shot meant to be dramatic and then withdrawn. Entire systems had gone dark within minutes, cut off from trade, from communication, from the basic rhythm of life they had never once had to question before that day. How many systems? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Charlotte did not look away from the console. Every system that depends on gates we now control, she said. Which is almost all of them. I thought of Vesa Core again, somewhere in council space, perhaps sitting inside a meeting room, much like the one where the vote had taken place days earlier, unaware that the very foundation of her civilization's daily life had just shifted beneath her, without any visible sign of struggle. A new voice broke through the open frequency, this one carrying a tone I recognized immediately, the practiced calm of official diplomatic language layered thinly over genuine alarm. It was a representative from the Council's Central Communication Office, addressing all listening frequencies at once. "This is an emergency broadcast," the voice said. "All gate systems within Council territory are currently experiencing an unprecedented and unexplained failure. All ships are advised to hold position. Engineering teams have been dispatched to investigate the cause. We ask for calm while this situation is resolved." Charlotte allowed herself the smallest, driest smile I had seen from her all day. "They believe this is a malfunction," she said. "That will not last long." She was right. Within the hour, a second broadcast followed, this one carrying far less composure than the first. Council engineering teams had apparently begun investigating the failure directly, only to discover something that no manual override, no diagnostic tool, no established protocol could explain. The gates had not failed. They had been redirected, locked beneath a layer of control that did not match any known engineering signature in Council records. "They found the new architecture," Nathan said, watching a stream of encrypted Council communication scroll across his display, communication our systems were now quietly able to intercept, because the access point sat exactly where humanity had placed it years earlier. I asked what would happen once the Council understood exactly who had done this. Charlotte turned to face me directly, for the first time since the countdown had reached 0. "That is where you come in," she said. "Because within the next few hours, once they exhaust every technical theory available to them, they will begin asking who benefits most from a network-wide failure of this exact kind. There is only one answer that fits every detail they will find, and they will need someone to explain it to them clearly, someone who can be trusted not to twist the truth into something crueler than it actually is." I did not feel ready for that responsibility, but there was no space left in that room, or in that moment, for feeling unready. Over the following hours, reports continued arriving from every corner of Council space, each one painting a clearer picture of exactly how deeply the galaxy depended on a system it had taken entirely for granted. Food shipments meant for outer colonies sat frozen in place at departure points, their destinations unreachable. Diplomatic envoys traveling between allied systems found themselves stranded halfway through their journeys, unable to complete negotiations that had taken years to arrange. Military vessels belonging to several Council-aligned species discovered, to their evident alarm, that their most advanced ships were just as powerless against the shutdown as unarmed trade vessels, because power had never been the deciding factor. Access was. I watched a live feed from a major council station near the heart of their territory, where crowds of different species had gathered near public displays, watching status boards that had once shown active travel routes, now filled with a single, repeated warning. Route unavailable. Destination unreachable. Please stand by for further instructions. There was no violence in those crowds, at least not yet, only a kind of stunned disbelief that seemed to ripple outward the longer the shutdown continued. I found myself oddly moved by that stillness, by the quiet realization, spreading across so many different species at once, that the thing they had built their entire civilization around was no longer fully theirs to control. Edward Miles entered the room quietly sometime during the third hour, carrying a datapad filled with updates from Earth's own leadership, gathered in emergency session since the moment the countdown reached 0. World leaders are unified, he said, addressing Charlotte directly. No dissent, no public statements beyond the agreed language. Every government understands the stakes of speaking out of turn right now. Charlotte nodded, clearly relieved, though she did not show it openly. And the council response? She asked. Confusion mostly, Edward said. Their engineering teams have identified the presence of an unfamiliar architecture layered into the network, but they have not yet connected it to us directly. That window will not stay open long. I asked how long we expected before that window closed completely. Edward turned toward me, his expression unreadable. Long enough for you to prepare exactly what you plan to say when they figure it out, he said. Because when they do, they will not send another routine delegation. They will send someone with real authority, someone capable of making decisions on behalf of the entire council, and that person will expect answers immediately. I spent the following hours reviewing every detail Charlotte's team could provide me, studying the specific language patterns most council delegates responded to, preparing arguments that framed our actions honestly rather than defensively. I did not want to stand before an angry delegation and offer excuses. I wanted to offer the truth, clearly enough that no version of it could later be twisted into something it was not. By the 6th hour after the shutdown began, reports confirmed that panic had begun spreading beyond stunned disbelief into something closer to organized fear. Several smaller species, heavily dependent on trade routes now severed by the failure, had begun demanding emergency sessions with the council's leadership, some openly questioning whether the council itself still deserved the trust it had held for centuries. Charlotte watched these reports with an expression I had not seen from her before, something between exhaustion and quiet vindication. They built an entire order around control of these gates, she said, around deciding who could travel, who could trade, who could be classified as property, and who could not. They never imagined losing that control even for a single day, because in their minds, that kind of loss was simply impossible. I asked her if she believed they would eventually forgive us for proving otherwise. She considered the question carefully before answering. Forgiveness was never the goal, she said. Respect was. And respect, unlike forgiveness, does not require them to feel warmly toward us. It only requires them to understand, without any doubt remaining, that whatever they decide about humanity from this point forward, they can no longer decide it without us in the room. By the time the 8th hour arrived, a message came through on the council's primary diplomatic frequency, addressed specifically to Earth by name for the first time since the shutdown began, no longer routed through vague emergency broadcasts or confused engineering updates. The message was short, and its tone had shifted entirely from the calm certainty I remembered from the chamber days earlier. Earth is requested, it read, to send a representative capable of explaining the current disruption, and to begin immediate discussion regarding its resolution. Charlotte read the message twice, then looked up at me with an expression that carried neither triumph nor relief, only quiet, steady resolve. They are asking for a conversation now, she said. For the first time in our history, this species is being asked, not summoned, not filed, not classified, asked. She handed me the message, and I understood, without needing to be told, exactly whose voice would be answering it. Before I could respond, a second transmission arrived on a private channel I recognized instantly, one reserved for direct communication between individual delegates, rather than official government channels. It was addressed to me personally, and the sender identification made my chest tighten before I had even opened it. Vesa Core. I hesitated for a moment before accepting the connection, uncertain whether I was authorized to speak with her directly outside official channels. Charlotte, watching my expression, simply nodded once, granting silent permission. Vesa's voice came through without her usual calm, the silver light patterns I imagined shifting rapidly behind whatever screen displayed her image on the other end. "Oliver," she said, using my name for the first time since we had met, something she had never done during our previous exchanges. "Tell me this is not what it appears to be." I asked her what exactly it appeared to be. "An entire network, disabled at once, in a pattern that our engineers cannot trace to any known cause," she said. "A pattern that began less than 1 full day after your species was formally registered. Tell me I am wrong to connect these two events." I thought carefully before answering, remembering everything Charlotte had told me about honesty over excuses. "You are not wrong," I said. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I wondered if the connection had failed. When she spoke again, her voice had lost the composed authority I remembered from the chamber entirely. "Do you understand what you have done?" she said. "Systems depending on medical transport have lost access to critical supplies. Colonies expecting food shipments within days now face uncertain timelines. You have created suffering across dozens of worlds that had nothing to do with the vote that classified your species." Her words struck harder than I expected, and for a moment, I felt the full weight of doubt settle over the certainty I had carried since the countdown reached 0. I thought of the crowds I had watched on that public display, stunned and frightened, most of them almost certainly uninvolved in any decision made about humanity's fate. I took a breath before answering honestly, rather than defensively. "I understand that innocent systems are suffering because of choices made by people who never had to justify classifying an entire species as property," I said. "I understand that this suffering is real, and I do not think anyone in this room is comfortable with that cost. But I also understand that for years, humanity offered cooperation, patience, and honesty to a council that responded by quietly preparing to file us away the moment it became convenient. We did not create this suffering out of cruelty. We created a consequence, because kindness alone was never going to be enough to protect us from becoming permanent property." Vesa did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though the tension remained. "There will be many voices calling for retaliation," she said, "voices far less patient than mine. I cannot promise you safety in the conversations that follow." "I never expected that promise," I said. "I only hope you can promise fairness." She ended the connection without answering, and I sat back in my chair, uncertain whether that exchange had helped our position or made it more dangerous. Charlotte placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "That conversation mattered more than you realize," she said. "She could have reported this exchange as a confession, to be used against us. Instead, she is likely to carry your words into whatever meeting decides how the council responds next. You gave her honesty, instead of an excuse. That is exactly what we needed." Over the following hours, more messages arrived, some official, some quietly informal, each one confirming that the shutdown's effects had spread further than even Charlotte's team had modeled. Reports described tense standoffs at major stations, where security forces struggled to manage crowds demanding answers no one could yet provide. A handful of smaller species, long dependent on council-mediated trade routes, began openly questioning whether continued membership under council authority still served their interests at all, now that its greatest promise, guaranteed access to travel, had proven fragile in a single afternoon. I watched those reports with a strange, complicated feeling rising in my chest, something between guilt and grim clarity. We had not simply challenged the Council's claim over humanity. We had exposed a fault line running through the foundation of the entire galactic order, one that had likely existed long before humans ever arrived to notice it. Nathan Cole, still monitoring intercepted communications from his station near the wall, spoke without looking up from his screen. "They are debating military options," he said. "Several delegates are pushing for immediate deployment toward Earth's system, regardless of the fact that ships attempting the journey would need working gates to arrive in any reasonable time frame." "Let them debate," Charlotte said. "Every hour spent arguing about force is an hour they are not spending finding a technical solution we have not already accounted for. I asked how confident she was that no technical solution existed on their end. She met my eyes directly. Confident enough to have built our entire plan around it, she said. But confidence is not certainty. Nothing about this moment is certain. That is exactly why they finally sent that message asking to talk, instead of demanding surrender. Somewhere in the 9th hour, Charlotte received a private update from an intelligence contact stationed near a major council administrative center, describing a scene that stayed with me long after that day ended. A gathering of junior officials, representing several smaller species who depended heavily on council trade guarantees, had assembled outside a closed session hall, demanding to know why their governments had never been warned that the entire network rested on architecture no current species actually understood. They are asking the right question, Charlotte said, reading the update aloud. Not why did humanity do this, but why did the council never tell us how fragile this system truly was? I asked her whether she believed that question would eventually turn against us as well, once the initial shock settled into something more analytical. It might, she said. Some will conclude that a system dependent on inherited technology no one fully controls was always unstable, regardless of who exposed that instability first. Others will conclude that we simply proved a weakness rather than created one. Both conclusions serve us better than the alternative, which would have been continuing to let that weakness remain hidden until someone with far less patience than us discovered it instead. Reports continued through the following hour describing smaller, quieter moments scattered across dozens of systems, moments that never made it into official council broadcasts but reached us through informal channels our engineers had quietly maintained for years. A group of traders stranded at a minor way station shared their remaining supplies without conflict, choosing patience over panic once it became clear that no immediate solution was coming. A medical transport crew, unable to reach their intended destination, redirected instead toward the nearest inhabited station and offered what assistance they could provide locally, rather than remaining idle while cargo meant for another world sat unused in their hold. I found something unexpectedly hopeful in those smaller reports, evidence that even amid genuine hardship, most individuals across most species responded with the same basic decency I would have hoped for from my own. It reminded me that whatever tensions existed between governments and councils, the ordinary people living within those systems were rarely so different from each other as official classifications suggested. Nathan noticed the shift in my expression and asked what I was thinking. I keep expecting to feel only guilt, I admitted, and instead, I keep finding small proof that most people, regardless of what species they belong to, handle hardship with more grace than the systems governing them ever earned credit for providing. He considered that for a moment before answering. Maybe that is the real argument for everything we are doing, he said. Not that any single species deserves more power than another, but that the individuals living under these systems deserve governments willing to treat them honestly, rather than filing away entire civilizations as property whenever convenient. By the 10th hour after the shutdown began, official confirmation arrived that a formal council delegation would be dispatched toward Earth, using the only transportation method still available to them, a slower, sublight vessel capable of reaching our system without relying on the very gate network we now controlled. The journey would take several days, an unthinkable delay for a civilization accustomed to traveling between stars in mere hours. Charlotte read the confirmation aloud to the room, her voice carrying the first genuine note of quiet satisfaction I had heard from her since the countdown reached 0. They are coming to us, she said, not summoning us to them, not filing a report about us in some chamber we are not permitted to enter, coming to us, on our terms, through space that only exists because we allowed their vessel safe passage through it. I looked at the glowing map still displayed across every screen in the room, the point marked home, pulsing steadily at its center, no longer small among the hundreds of larger, older systems surrounding it. For the first time since stepping into that observation booth days earlier, I allowed myself to feel something other than fear or grim resolve. It was smaller than pride and heavier than relief, but it was real, and it settled quietly into the same place where cold uncertainty had lived only hours before. We had not simply survived being classified as property. We had forced an entire galaxy to reconsider what that word could possibly mean, when the species it was applied to refused to accept it as final. The council vessel arrived 4 days later, drifting into the outer edge of our solar system at a speed that would have seemed painfully slow to any of its crew only a week earlier. I stood beside Charlotte and Edward Miles in a reception hall built specifically for this meeting, a wide room with clear walls overlooking the coastline, chosen deliberately to remind our visitors that this world, whatever else it had done, was still simply a home. 3 delegates disembarked when the shuttle finally landed. I recognized none of them at first, though their formal robes marked them as senior council officials, far above the rank of anyone who had handled our species' original classification. The lead delegate introduced herself as Threll Van, speaking through a translator device rather than relying on any shared language, her voice measured and careful in a way that told me she had rehearsed this moment many times during the long journey. "You understand the significance of what you have done," Threll said, once the formal introductions concluded, and we were seated across a long table in the center of the hall. "We understand it fully," Charlotte replied. "We would not have done it otherwise." Threll studied her for a long moment before continuing. "Millions across dozens of systems have experienced hardship because of your actions," she said. "Food shortages, medical delays, economic disruption on a scale the Council has not faced in living memory. Do you deny responsibility for this suffering?" "We do not deny it," Charlotte said. "We accept full responsibility for the disruption we caused, and we regret the hardship experienced by species who had no part in classifying us as property. That regret does not change our position. It only shapes how quickly we are willing to restore access, once fair terms are agreed upon." I watched Threll's expression shift slightly, something between frustration and reluctant respect. She turned toward me next, addressing me directly for the first time. "You spoke with Delegate Vesa Kor during the disruption," she said. "She reported your words to the full council before we departed. You told her this was not cruelty, but consequence. Explain that distinction to me now, in person, so I may judge for myself whether it holds any honesty." I felt the weight of every eye in that room settle on me, and I remembered Charlotte's instruction from days earlier. Honesty, not excuses. "Cruelty is causing harm because you want someone to suffer," I said. "Consequence is causing disruption because the alternative, accepting permanent classification as property, was never something any free species could accept and still call itself free. We did not choose this path because we wanted to hurt anyone. We chose it because every peaceful option available to us led to the same outcome, filed away, owned, and forgotten. This was the only door that led somewhere else." Threll was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not read. "You are young for this role," she finally said. "I am the person who happened to be standing in the room when the vote was read aloud," I answered. "That is not the same as being the wisest voice available, but it is the voice that has been asked to speak, and I intend to speak honestly, whatever judgment follows." Something in her posture eased slightly, though her formal tone did not soften. "The Council did not anticipate resistance of this scale from a species so recently classified," Threll said. "Our records described your civilization as primitive, disorganized, and incapable of unified action across multiple governments. Those records were clearly incomplete. Those records were written by people who never asked us a single direct question about our own capabilities," Edward Miles said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "They assumed conclusions instead of requesting evidence. That assumption cost the Council more in 4 days than any careful investigation would have cost them in years." Threll did not argue the point. Instead, she reached into a case beside her seat and withdrew a data device, sliding it across the table toward Charlotte. "The Council is prepared to discuss revised terms," she said. "Full restoration of species status, recognition as an independent civilization rather than an unregistered asset, and formal representation within Council proceedings going forward. In exchange, we require immediate restoration of gate access across all affected systems, along with guarantees that no further disruption of this kind will occur without formal warning." Charlotte studied the device for a long moment before responding. "We are prepared to discuss those terms," she said, "but formal representation alone is not sufficient. We require a permanent, binding recognition that no species can be reclassified as property under any future vote, regardless of circumstance. What happened to us must never be allowed to happen to any species discovered after us." Threll's expression sharpened. "You are asking us to rewrite Council law itself. We are asking the Council to prove it has learned something from this experience," Charlotte said. Otherwise, the next unclaimed species the Council discovers may not have the technical means we happen to possess. They may simply disappear into the registry, the way our species nearly did, with no one left to shut down a single gate on their behalf. The room fell silent, and I watched Threll consider the weight of that argument carefully, her earlier frustration giving way slowly to something closer to genuine reflection. That provision would require unanimous agreement among all current council members, she said. Some will resist it fiercely. There are species who benefit from the current order exactly as it stands. Then those species will need to decide, Edward said, whether they value that benefit more than they value continued access to gates, a species outside their control currently holds the keys to. Threll allowed a small, tired sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. You speak plainly for a species the Council once considered too primitive to understand its own situation, she said. We understood our situation perfectly, I said. We simply chose not to accept it quietly. Negotiations continued over the following 2 days, moving between formal sessions in that same reception hall and quieter private discussions, where smaller details were worked through without the weight of ceremony. I found myself present for most of them, translating not just language but intention, explaining to Threll and her colleagues why certain human positions were held so firmly, and explaining to Charlotte and Edward why certain council hesitations were not simply stubbornness, but genuine fear of setting precedents that could destabilize agreements between dozens of other species, entirely unrelated to our dispute. During a quiet break on the second day, Threll approached me alone near the wide, clear windows overlooking the coastline, her formal manner softened slightly by exhaustion. May I ask you something outside the negotiation itself, she said. I nodded. Do you believe your species will use this new position wisely, she asked. Power gained through disruption is rarely used gently by those who gain it. History across many species proves this pattern repeats itself. I considered the question honestly before answering. I do not know yet, I admitted. I know we did not seek this position because we wanted power over anyone else. We sought it because we refused to exist beneath someone else's control. Whether we use it wisely will depend on choices none of us have made yet. I can only tell you that the same instinct which made us reject being owned will make many of us equally uncomfortable with owning others in return. Threll studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if satisfied with an answer that offered no guarantees, only honesty. That may be the wisest thing anyone has said to me since this crisis began, she said quietly, before returning to the negotiation table. During the middle of the second day, a fourth delegate joined the talks briefly, a representative from one of the smaller trade-dependent species whose systems had suffered heavily during the disruption. He introduced himself simply as Kale, speaking without the formal caution the senior council officials had maintained throughout the process. My people lost weeks of stored supplies, waiting for shipments that never arrived, he said, addressing the table directly, rather than routing his comments through Threll. I did not come here to discuss abstract principles about property and freedom. I came to ask whether an agreement between your species and the Council will actually prevent this kind of disruption from happening again, regardless of who causes it next time. Charlotte answered him directly, without hesitation. The provision we are requesting exists specifically to prevent situations like the one your people experienced, she said. If no species can be classified as property, no species will ever again feel forced into the position we found ourselves in only days ago. That protects worlds like yours as much as it protects us. Kale studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust an explanation offered by the very species responsible for his people's recent hardship. Convenient reasoning, he said, coming from the side that benefits most from the change. It is convenient, Edward said. It is also true. Both things can exist together. We are not asking you to forget what our actions cost your people. We are asking you to consider whether the alternative, a galaxy where any government can quietly file away a species that has not yet found powerful allies, actually serves anyone's long-term interest, including yours. Kale did not offer immediate agreement, but he did not leave the table either, remaining through the rest of that day's session, listening more than he spoke. By the time he departed that evening, his final words carried less hostility than his opening ones had. I will report to my government that this agreement, whatever its origin, appears designed to protect species like mine, as much as species like yours, he said. Whether that proves true will depend entirely on what happens after the signatures are placed. By the end of the second day, a draft agreement had taken shape, one that neither side fully celebrated, but both sides could accept without feeling as though they had surrendered something essential. Full restoration of gate access would begin within hours of final signature. Humanity would be granted recognized status as an independent civilization, with formal representation in future council proceedings. And a new provision, still requiring ratification among the full council membership, would prohibit the classification of any species as property under any future circumstance. Charlotte reviewed the final draft late into the night, alongside Edward and two other officials who had joined partway through the process. I sat quietly nearby, exhausted in a way that reached deeper than simple tiredness, the accumulated weight of days spent translating not just words, but the space between two civilizations, trying to understand each other for the very first time. "This will not satisfy everyone," Charlotte said finally, setting the draft down. "There are people on Earth who wanted us to demand far more. There are delegates within the Council who will resist even this much change for years. No agreement this significant ever satisfies everyone completely," Edward said. "The measure of its success will not be whether everyone is pleased. It will be whether both sides can still speak to each other honestly, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, long after this crisis has become history rather than headline." I thought about Vesa Kaur's calm voice from that very first day, telling me not to be alarmed, that our classification was simply standard procedure. I thought about the fear in her voice days later, asking whether I understood what we had done. I wondered whether an agreement built from such an unusual beginning could ever fully heal the distance between species who had started this relationship, with one side believing it owned the other. I did not know the answer yet. I only knew that for the first time since stepping into that glass observation booth, humanity was no longer waiting to find out what the galaxy would decide to do with us. We were deciding, together with them, what came next. The formal signing took place 6 days after the shutdown began, in a hall built quickly on the outskirts of the capital, large enough to accommodate representatives from every species with a stake in what was about to be decided. Vesa Kaur attended in person this time, her silver form settled into a container designed to keep her comfortable on land, her light patterns steady, in a way I had not seen since our very first meeting in the council chamber. She found me before the ceremony began, standing near the edge of the hall where sunlight filtered through wide windows onto polished stone floors. "I did not expect to stand on your world so soon after our last conversation," she said. "I did not expect to still be standing at all," I admitted, and something in her light patterns shifted in a way I had come to recognize as quiet amusement. "You spoke honestly with me during the crisis," she said. "Many in my position would have resented that honesty. I found myself respecting it instead, though I did not fully understand why, until I watched the negotiations unfold over these past days." I asked her what she had come to understand. "Your species did not seek to replace the council," she said. "You sought only to no longer be beneath it. That distinction matters more than most delegates initially realized. A species seeking power looks very different from a species seeking equality, once you know what to watch for." The ceremony itself was brief, almost anticlimactic given everything that had led to it. Threll Van stood at the podium alongside Charlotte and Edward, reading the final terms aloud to the gathered representatives, terms that would restore gate access across every affected system within hours of the ceremony's conclusion. Terms that formally recognized humanity as an independent civilization rather than an unclaimed asset. Terms that established, for the first time in recorded council history, a binding prohibition against classifying any newly discovered species as property under any future circumstance. When the final signatures were placed, a quiet murmur passed through the gathered delegates, not celebration exactly, but something closer to a collective release of tension that had been building since the moment the gates first went dark. Charlotte found me afterward, standing near the same windows where Vesa and I had spoken earlier, watching the sunlight stretch long shadows across the stone floor as the afternoon wore on. "You did well these past days," she said. "Better than most of us expected from someone thrown into this role without warning." "I did not feel ready for any of it," I said honestly. "Nobody who matters in moments like these ever feels ready," she said. "Readiness is not the requirement. Honesty is. You gave them that, again and again, when it would have been easier to offer comfortable excuses instead. I asked her what came next, now that the immediate crisis had passed. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Now the harder work begins," she said. "Building trust takes far longer than breaking dependence ever did. We have proven we cannot be owned. We still need to prove we can be trusted as partners, not just feared as a species capable of shutting down half a galaxy's transportation network in a single afternoon." Over the following weeks, I remained involved in the slow, careful work of turning that signed agreement into something that functioned in practice, rather than existing only on paper. Trade routes resumed gradually, first for essential supplies delayed during the shutdown, then for the broader network of commerce that connected hundreds of worlds across Council space. Humanity's new representatives began attending Council sessions, not as observers confined to a glass booth above the chamber floor, but as seated members with a voice equal to any other recognized species. I attended several of those early sessions myself, watching delegates who had once dismissed humanity as negligible now choose their words with visible care whenever a human representative rose to speak. It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was something far more valuable in that setting. It was caution born of respect, the kind that comes only after underestimating someone once and paying dearly for the mistake. Nathan Cole found me during one of those visits, standing near the same observation area where I had first watched our species get filed away as property, what felt like a lifetime earlier, though barely 2 months had passed. "Strange, being back here," he said, looking out over the chamber floor. "Strange is one word for it," I said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the delegates below settle into their positions for the day's session. "Do you think they will ever fully trust us?" he asked. "I think trust was never really the point," I said, echoing something Charlotte had told me weeks earlier, words that had settled deeper into my understanding with each passing day since. "I think respect was always the actual goal. Trust might follow, given enough time, enough honesty, enough proof that we intend to keep our word, now that we finally have a voice in how these agreements are shaped. But even without full trust, respect changes everything about how a species is treated. It means no one gets to file you away quietly again, simply because filing you away seemed more convenient than asking what you actually wanted." Nathan nodded slowly, considering that for a long moment before speaking again. "You have changed since that first day in the booth," he said. "Everyone changes, watching their species declared property, and then choosing to answer that declaration instead of accepting it," I said. "I do not think I could go back to being the person who simply translated words without understanding what those words could cost, even if I wanted to." I thought often, during those quiet weeks of rebuilding, about the version of myself who had sat frozen in that glass booth, watching a simple line of text rearrange the entire meaning of my life and the lives of billions of people who had no idea, in that exact moment, that anything had changed at all. I thought about Charlotte's steady certainty, about Edward's careful precision, about Nathan's quiet confidence that being underestimated had never been a weakness worth resenting, only a tool worth using wisely. Mostly I thought about Vesicor's question, asked quietly near a window on the day of the signing, whether humanity would use its new position wisely, now that ownership was no longer a threat hanging over our heads. I did not have a certain answer for her then, and I still do not have one now, months later, watching our new representatives navigate council politics with the same careful mixture of confidence and humility that had carried us through the crisis itself. I only know that whatever comes next, whatever challenges rise from a galaxy still adjusting to a species at once dismissed as negligible, we no longer face those challenges from beneath anyone else's authority. We face them standing at the table, as equals, having proven that our silence during those early years was never a sign of ignorance or weakness. It was patience, spent quietly earning the one thing that could never again be taken from us without our consent. A voice, in a conversation that finally includes us, not because anyone granted us permission to speak, but because we made certain, once and completely, that no one could ever again pretend we did not deserve to be heard. I still keep the original transmission I sent that first day, the recording where my voice trembles slightly as I describe words appearing on a screen. I never expected to change my life so completely. I listen to it sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of exactly how quickly certainty can be built from nothing more than the decision to answer silence with action. Grace Whitfield returned to Earth for a brief visit during those first months of rebuilding. The same engineer, whose quiet curiosity years earlier had first uncovered the pattern that made everything else possible. I met her once, at a small gathering held to recognize the researchers whose patient work had gone unnoticed for so long, outside a narrow circle of officials. "Did you ever imagine it would come to this?" I asked her, "when you first noticed that pattern in the maintenance logs?" She smiled, tired but genuine. "I imagined a footnote in some engineering report," she said. "I never imagined a footnote could end up rewriting how an entire galaxy treats species it has not yet met. I am not sure anyone truly imagines that, until it happens." "Do you regret how it was used?" I asked. She considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the hardship it caused innocent systems," she said. "I do not regret that it existed when we needed it most. Those two feelings are not in conflict. They simply both happened to be true at the same time." I carried her answer with me longer than I expected to, turning it over during quiet evenings, when the weight of everything that had happened settled fully upon me for the first time, once the adrenaline of those first weeks had finally faded into something closer to ordinary life. The gates remain open now, connecting our world to hundreds of others, no longer symbols of dependence, but proof of a choice we made together, as a species that refused, when the moment finally arrived, to remain quietly filed away. We were never property. We simply waited, until the entire galaxy was finally ready to understand that difference for itself.